The evening train in Charlotte had always carried with it a rhythm of routine. People boarded with bags slung over their shoulders, their expressions weary but calm after a long day. The metallic hum of the wheels against the track blended with the soft murmur of conversations, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional ring of a cell phone. For most passengers, it was a moment of transition, a pocket of time to unwind, to scroll through messages, or to stare absent-mindedly at the dimly lit city sliding by the windows. It was supposed to be another uneventful ride, one of thousands that had come before it. Near the middle of the train, a young traveler had just found a seat by the window. He carried nothing unusual, just a small bag and the tired look of someone who had grown used to moving through unfamiliar places. A few rows away, a mother whispered to her daughter, coaxing her into finishing a snack before they reached their stop. At the far end, two friends laughed over a shared video on one of their phones, their voices bubbling with energy despite the fatigue of the day. Everything was normal, or at least it seemed so, until the balance of that ordinariness fractured in the most sudden and violent way imaginable. It began without warning. A man, who had been seated quietly near the door, rose abruptly. Some passengers noticed the sharpness in his movements, a kind of jittering restlessness that seemed out of place. Within seconds, he pulled something from beneath his coat. At first, there was confusion, a flicker of metal, a glint under the dim train lights, and then the realization struck with horrifying clarity. He held a knife, and before anyone could fully register what was happening, he lunged at the young traveler by the window. The first scream echoed down the aisle, sharp and jagged. People froze, their eyes wide, their minds struggling to catch up with the chaos unraveling before them. The sound of the knife cutting through the quiet was followed by a chorus of shouts. The victim tried desperately to shield himself, to push away, but the narrow confines of the seat offered no escape. Panic rippled outward like a wave. Some passengers bolted from their seats, clawing at the doors even though the train was still moving. Others ducked behind seats, clutching their children, begging for the violence to stop. The train's hum, once steady and reassuring, now felt menacing, like a cage trapping everyone inside. The conductor, alerted by the sudden uproar, activated the emergency brake. The train screeched as metal ground against metal, throwing sparks into the night outside. Passengers stumbled as the cars jolted violently, cries of fear and confusion mingling in the suffocating air. The young man's voice was drowned out by the chaos, the shouts, the pounding footsteps, the desperate prayers. In mere moments, the mundane had become horrific, a nightmare written across the faces of everyone trapped inside. A brave few passengers attempted to intervene. A man in his 30s grabbed his backpack and swung it toward the attacker, trying to knock the weapon away. Another tried to pull the assailant back by his coat, but the fury in the attacker's movements was unrelenting. The knife slashed through the space, forcing even the would-be helpers to retreat for their own safety. The attacker's rage seemed senseless, blind, as though the target had been chosen not by reason but by the dark impulse of the moment. As the train ground to a halt, the doors hissed open. Passengers spilled out onto the platform, some tripping in their desperate rush to escape, others sobbing uncontrollably as they clutched their loved ones. A mother dragged her child close to her chest, shielding her eyes from the scene inside. Friends clung to each other, their voices trembling as they tried to recount what had just happened. The air outside felt cold and harsh, but it carried with it the relief of survival. Inside, the chaos had left behind a haunting silence, broken only by the shallow gasps of the victim and the heavy footsteps of the attacker as he darted out the opposite door. His figure disappeared into the shadows beyond the tracks, swallowed by the night as quickly as he had emerged from it. The randomness of it all, the sheer unpredictability, was what left the survivors shaken the most. There had been no argument, no warning, no words exchanged, just a sudden eruption of violence that stole the normalcy from their evening. For those who had witnessed it, the images were already etched into memory. The glint of the knife, the scream that echoed down the aisle, the helplessness of being trapped in a moving train with nowhere to go, these fragments replayed in their minds like a broken film reel. Some passengers clutched their phones with trembling hands, fumbling to call 911, their voices cracking as they described the scene to dispatchers. Others simply stood frozen on the platform, unable to look back, unwilling to believe that what they had seen was real. The sirens came quickly, their wails slicing through the night. Police cars and ambulances flooded the station, lights flashing red and blue across the metal of the train. Officers sprinted onto the platform, weapons drawn, scanning for the attacker who had already vanished. Paramedics pushed through the crowd of dazed passengers, rushing toward the injured man inside the carriage. For the community gathered there, time seemed to blur, minutes stretched like hours as the weight of what had happened sank deeper into their hearts. In that moment, Charlotte felt smaller, more fragile, as though the comfort of everyday life had been pierced by something that could never be fully explained. The ordinary train ride had become a tragedy, a scene of senseless violence that would echo through the city for days to come. And for those who had been on board, the memory of that night, the sound of fear, the sight of panic, and the chilling unpredictability of a stranger's attack would haunt them long after the flashing lights faded and the headlines moved on. Would you like me to now expand Scene 2 into a 1,000-word continuation, keeping the same style and flow? Here's the fictional expanded version of Scene 2, around 1,000 words, with no headings, just flowing narrative. Police units raced toward the Charlotte train station as the first wave of 911 calls poured in, each caller's voice frantic and broken. Some described a stabbing. Others could only shout through sobs that someone was hurt, that the train was chaos, that people were running everywhere. Dispatchers tried to piece together fragments, but the picture was already clear. This was no ordinary disturbance. It was something far more terrifying. When the first officers arrived, they were met with a crowd of trembling passengers. Their eyes were wide, some streaked with tears, some staring blankly as though they were still trapped inside that train car. A young woman clutched her phone with white knuckles, repeating over and over that she had seen the knife, that it was glinting under the lights. A man with blood smeared across his sleeve explained how he had tried to shield the victim, his voice catching as he admitted he had failed. The stories spilled out in fragments, each one overlapping, painting a picture that was almost too horrific to comprehend. Inside the carriage, paramedics were already on their knees beside the young victim, their voices urgent but calm as they worked to stabilize him. Oxygen masks secured, compressions measured, the rhythmic beeps of medical equipment broke the silence that had settled over the space. Around them, officers placed cones and markers, snapping photographs of blood streaks on the seats, a backpack abandoned mid-aisle, a trail of footprints leading toward the door. It was methodical work against a backdrop of chaos, each step designed to preserve evidence while the memory of screams still hung in the air. Meanwhile, the attacker was gone. Witnesses had pointed in the direction he fled, down the platform, across the tracks, and into the maze of side streets that twisted into the city. Within minutes, police radios crackled with alerts, descriptions, and urgent commands. Helicopters lifted into the air, their searchlights cutting across rooftops, bathing neighborhoods in harsh white beams. Squad cars prowled through intersections, tires screeching as they responded to each tip or shadow sighting. Yet the city's size worked in the attacker's favor. With each passing minute, he was swallowed deeper into the night. For the passengers, the hours following the attack blurred together. They stood behind police tape, wrapped in foil emergency blankets, giving statements to detectives who scribbled notes into pads. Each retelling was a strain. Some could barely speak, their words breaking apart as they tried to recall the details. Others spoke in bursts, insisting they remembered every second, only to falter when pressed for precision. Trauma had twisted time, minutes had stretched, images had overlapped, and what was left were fragments, the glint of a blade, the scream of a child, the metallic screech of the train halting. Reporters arrived in waves, their cameras glaring, their microphones extended like weapons of their own. They pressed passengers for quotes, eager to capture the raw emotions spilling into the night. Some survivors turned away, unwilling to relive what had just happened. Others spoke, their voices trembling as they begged for justice, for the suspect to be caught before anyone else suffered. One man, his clothes still flecked with the victim's blood, looked directly into the lens and declared that he would never feel safe on that train again. His words cut across television screens within the hour, repeated on every news channel, looping endlessly as the city tried to process the horror. For Charlotte, it was as though the city had been pierced by something foreign, something that did not belong. People asked each other the same questions. Why here? Why this train? Why that victim? The randomness of it was the hardest part to accept. Had the attacker targeted the young traveler for a reason, or had the choice been completely arbitrary? That lack of clarity left a gnawing unease, because if it could happen once without warning, it could happen again. Detectives held a press conference near midnight. Floodlights lit the area around the station, casting long shadows of microphones clustered at the podium. The police chief's voice was steady, but the words were grim. Yes, the attack had been confirmed as fatal. Yes, the suspect was still at large. And yes, every available resource was being poured into finding him. He urged calm, asked for cooperation, and reminded the community that justice would come. Behind him, officers in tactical gear moved with a sense of urgency, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. As the night dragged on, vigils began to form spontaneously. At one station exit, commuters placed candles on the ground, their flames flickering in the wind. A small pile of flowers appeared, then grew as more people arrived, hands shaking as they laid down bouquets wrapped in paper or single stems pulled hastily from home gardens. Strangers stood side by side, whispering prayers, their silence louder than any speech. Some cried openly, others simply stood with arms folded tightly, the weight of disbelief pressing down on them. The tragedy had already transformed from an isolated act into a communal wound. On social media, the story spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended within hours, filled with shock, anger, and grief. Some users posted clips from the train platform, shaky videos of passengers running, of police rushing in, of sirens piercing the night. Others shared images of candles and memorials, attaching messages of solidarity. A divide also emerged, with arguments erupting in comment threads about crime, safety, and accountability. For every message of compassion, there was another filled with outrage, demanding change, demanding answers, demanding someone to blame. The tragedy had spilled far beyond Charlotte, becoming a national conversation before the blood on the train seats had even dried. Meanwhile, the manhunt pressed on. Officers knocked on doors, following leads, piecing together surveillance footage from stations, businesses, and street corners. The suspect's silhouette appeared in grainy clips, sometimes clear enough to recognize his hooded figure, sometimes blurred into nothingness. Each frame was studied, slowed down, compared against witness testimony. But he remained elusive, a shadow darting just beyond the reach of the law. For those who had been on the train, the night replayed again and again in their minds. Some lay awake in their beds, flinching at every sound outside their windows, convinced the attacker might still be near. Others sat in silence, staring at their hands as if still feeling the vibrations of the train beneath them, still hearing the sudden eruption of screams. The city had moved forward, but for them, time had frozen in that carriage, in that instant when normal life had been ripped away. Charlotte was stunned, yes, but beneath the shock lay a deeper truth: the community was frightened. They had seen how fragile their sense of safety truly was, how quickly routine could twist into tragedy. And as the helicopters droned overhead and police searched the shadows, one thought echoed through every home, every phone screen, every whispered prayer, until the attacker was caught. No one could feel truly safe again. The search for the suspect stretched well into the night, a citywide operation that consumed Charlotte with a sense of dread. Helicopters hovered above neighborhoods, their beams of white light cutting through trees and bouncing off rooftops, moving methodically across streets as if chasing shadows themselves. Police cruisers blocked off intersections, their red and blue lights flashing against storefronts, casting eerie patterns over shuttered windows. Officers in tactical gear swept through wooded areas near the tracks, their voices low but urgent, radios crackling with every update. The manhunt had turned the city into a tense grid, every corner a possible hiding place, every stranger a potential threat. Residents peered from behind curtains, watching the spectacle unfold with unease. The police loudspeakers echoed down quiet streets, urging people to remain indoors, to lock their doors and report anything suspicious. For many, it was the first time they had ever felt hunted themselves, not by the suspect, but by the idea that violence could be lurking so close. Parents held their children tighter, phones buzzed with alerts, and social media filled with live posts from people documenting the flashing lights outside their homes. Fear spread quickly, and though the suspect was only one man, his absence created the illusion that danger was everywhere. Back at the train station, the platform had transformed into a memorial. By dawn, candles flickered in clusters, wax pooling on the concrete as more and more people arrived to pay their respects. Flowers of every color piled up, some carefully arranged, others laid hastily, but with heartfelt intention. Handmade signs leaned against the station wall, scrawled with messages like, "We stand together," and "Justice for Charlotte." Strangers hugged, tears streaked their faces, and the silence of the gathering was broken only by the occasional sob. The weight of grief pressed heavily on everyone present, a reminder that while investigators searched for the suspect, the community itself was left to wrestle with the trauma. The victim's name began to circulate, and with it came stories of who he had been: young, hopeful, far from home, someone who carried dreams that ended abruptly on a train ride, meant to be safe. The randomness of his death struck people hardest. There had been no reason, no warning, no quarrel to explain it. That sense of unpredictability terrified the community, because if safety could vanish so quickly for him, it could vanish for anyone. The tragedy did not feel distant or detached. It felt personal, a wound shared by all who called the city home. Reporters continued to swarm the scene, broadcasting live from the platform as early commuters stopped in their tracks to watch. The story had spread nationally, with anchors speaking somberly about the attack, comparing it to other moments when violence erupted in public spaces once thought secure. Commentators debated the state of public safety on transit systems, while others highlighted the vulnerability of communities who often relied on them. In the digital world, hashtags tied to the tragedy trended relentlessly, creating a storm of grief, outrage, and calls for justice. But as the media frenzy built, so did the frustration. People wanted answers. Why hadn't the suspect been caught yet? How had he escaped so quickly? Was there enough security on the train in the first place? City officials faced mounting pressure to reassure residents while police officers worked without rest, chasing down every lead, piecing together surveillance footage, and conducting interviews deep into the night. For every door they knocked on, every alley they searched, the suspect remained elusive, leaving behind only fear and speculation. For the passengers who had lived through the attack, the city's grief carried an even heavier weight. Many struggled to return home, replaying the moment in their minds again and again. The glint of the knife, the screams, the jolt of the train as it came to a halt, these details lingered like scars. Some refused to ride the train again, even for essential commutes. Others found themselves speaking softly, startling easily, their confidence in ordinary life broken. Support groups began forming online, places where survivors and witnesses could connect, share their trauma, and try to make sense of what had happened. Yet for many, words fell short, because no amount of conversation could undo the images burned into their memory. As the second night fell over Charlotte, the suspect was still at large. Searchlights continued their sweep, patrol cars still cut across intersections, and officers maintained their hunt with unwavering persistence. But the longer the manhunt dragged on, the deeper the unease grew. Rumors began to circulate that the suspect had fled the city, that he was hiding in abandoned buildings, that he was armed and preparing to strike again. Each rumor fueled anxiety, and though the police issued statements to quell misinformation, fear was not so easily calmed. Community leaders stepped in, calling for resilience and unity. Vigils expanded from the train station to churches, parks, and schools. Crowds gathered with candles and songs, speaking the victim's name aloud as if refusing to let him vanish into a statistic. Faith leaders delivered sermons about healing, urging people not to let fear define their lives. Yet, even in these moments of solidarity, the presence of heavily armed officers nearby was a stark reminder of the danger that lingered. Charlotte was grieving, but it was also bracing for what might come next. For some, the tragedies sparked anger rather than fear. Activists demanded stronger measures for transit security, pressing city officials to install cameras, increase patrols, and create safer environments for riders. Others argued the focus should be on deeper societal issues, mental health, inequality, the cracks through which people fell until desperation or violence consumed them. The debates raged online and in town halls, reflecting not only the pain of loss, but also the desperate search for meaning in a senseless act. The young victim's story became the heart of every discussion. He was not just a name, not just a headline, but a reminder of the fragility of life and the injustice of chance. Photos of his smile circulated widely, and each one fueled the anger, grief, and determination of a community unwilling to forget. His death became a symbol, not only of violence endured but of a city's demand for change, for safety, and for justice. By the third day, Charlotte's grief had hardened into resolve. Police vowed publicly that the suspect would be caught, no matter how long it took, no matter how far he ran. Detectives worked around the clock, their evidence boards filling with photographs, maps, and lines connecting witness statements to surveillance frames. But outside the investigation, the city itself had changed. Commuters looked at each other differently on trains, eyes lingering with suspicion. Parents held their children closer. Strangers spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of their fear. The wound was not just in one family or one group of passengers, it was in the entire fabric of the community. Even as time passed, the memory of that night lingered. The screech of the train, the flashing lights, the figure fleeing into the dark, they became symbols of a moment that Charlotte could never undo. The suspect might one day be caught, the investigation might one day end, but the legacy of the attack would remain etched into the city's history. And for those who had lived it, the tragedy was not just a headline but a shadow that followed them, a reminder that safety is fragile, and that sometimes the ordinary can collapse into horror without warning.